Hey, welcome back! In this video, we will again be having a look at a brand new CSS feature. This time that feature is CSS scroll-driven animations. Because I've created multiple videos where we create scroll animations with Framer Motion. And Framer Motion is amazing for this. I even have a full course coming up on Frontend FYI Pro where I'm gonna teach you all about it. But if there is something that native CSS can do where you don't need any specific library to do the same thing, then you should always opt for that because it's always faster to do. So just over a week ago, I came across this tweet on Twitter or X or whatever the platform is called tomorrow. And what you see here is that when the user scrolls, the text shrinks down. And I thought by myself, well, that's a great use case for CSS scroll-driven animations. So I created this very small code sandbox down here that does exactly the same thing with scroll-driven animations. But in today's video, we will be creating an example that looks just a little bit better, has a little bit more animations, and is also built with Tailwind. So what the example does is exactly this. We have a hero component that as soon as you start scrolling, the text moves down just a little bit and fades out. And if you keep on scrolling, there's this quote in the middle that if you keep on scrolling, it will become bigger as well. And you also see there is some sort of parallax effect where it moves at a different speed compared to the rest of the page. And then it becomes bigger and stays in place. Both of these things we're gonna make with the CSS scroll-driven animations. If we take a quick look at the Can I Use website, you see that the scroll timeline is still completely red. There is, however, quite a few flags already here, which means that this API is available behind a flag. And also that it's gonna be released pretty soon as a stable API as well. So right now you see that pretty much all browsers already have it included behind a flag, where only Safari is still lacking, but hopefully will follow soon as well. But the great thing about this is that if you already add it, all browsers simply won't have an animation, but it will still work. And because the release is so close, I already wanted to show you today how this works so you can start using it as soon as it lands stable in a browser. For now, if you want to enable this in Chrome, you need to go to Chrome://flags. And in there, you need to enable the experimental web platform features. This gives you access to all of the new preview functionalities in the browser, of which the scroll-driven animations is one. So let's jump right in and take a look at the starting point we have today. If I remove all of the animations, then this is what we're left with. It's a basic header that doesn't do anything when you scroll. And the quote is also there, just a little bit bigger, but also doesn't move, doesn't zoom in. So what is the first step that we have to take? Well, also these scroll-driven animations, they're all based on the simple principle of CSS animations. So that means that they also work with CSS keyframe animations. So the first step we're gonna take is actually create a keyframe animation that moves the text down as well as fades it out. For that, I'm gonna open my Tailwind config, but you can also create this in plain CSS, of course. But in Tailwind, we need to add a keyframes object in which we can add our own keyframe animations. So let's create an animation called fade out down. So in there, we have a from property, which is the starting point of our animation. And at that starting point, the opacity will be 1. And we also have a transform of translate y of 0. And then the second property we have is the to state of our animation, which will be the end. And from and to, you could also write as 0 and 100%. They are exactly the same. So the to state of our animation will be an opacity of 0, and we'll have a translate y. Well, Copilot says 20 pixels, but let's, for example, make this 40%. So now we have defined these keyframes. We also need to create an animation in Tailwind. We do that by adding the animation property. And you already see that Copilot is suggesting us to create a specific animation. Well, fade out down seems good to me. The name of the keyframe is also fine. And the duration and the easing, for now, we also leave that in place. So if we would add both of these properties and we would go back to our page, then we could go to our H1 and add the class name Animate, and then choose Fade Out Down. And what you already saw is that the text moves and fades down. But for now, this is just a regular animation. We actually want to attach this animation to a scroll position. And that's the part where we are going to add the scroll-driven animations. The first property we are going to need is animation timeline. And because this is not a class name that Tailwind generates yet, we need to use square bracket so we can use any CSS property we would like. In there, we're going to add animation timeline :scroll as a function. And that's the first very important step we have to do. Because if we now start scrolling, you will see that our text slowly fades out. And it's also moving down, but because we have to scroll such a big distance, you don't really see that. But the animation is now already tied into the scrolling position. And that's all by using this scroll function. Because if you don't pass any argument to this function, it will make the full timeline of the animation the full scroll of your body. There's other settings for this scroll function as well, but that's something that's beyond the scope of this video. We can, however, tell the browser that it shouldn't use the full height of the page as the scroll distance, but only limit it to a specific range. And that's the next magic keyword, because there is another property in CSS that we can use now. And that property is animation range, where we can give it two values, which is the starting point as well as the end point of the range. So we can, for example, say we want to start at 0 pixels and we want to end at 300 pixels. So that tells the browser that it should look at this scroll distance, but only for a specific range. So if we now scroll, you see that it animates a lot quicker. The thing you do, however, also see is that it jumps around. And that is because by default, if an animation ends, which goes for all CSS animations, it will end at its beginning state, unless you add the forwards argument to your animation as well. So if we go back into our Tailwind config and add forwards to our animation, what that will do is it will make sure that the animation stays at the end when it finishes. So if we now scroll, it will fade out and it will be gone forever until we scroll back up. Then it will run the exact same animation in reverse. And pretty much that's the only thing you need to do if you want to create a scroll animation that is based on the scroll position of the document. Unless you also want to support browsers that don't support scroll-driven animations yet. Because if I would open the exact same URL in Safari, this is what you would see. And why is that? That is because the browser is ignoring everything for the scroll timelines, but it is using the animation. So it will simply animate the text out as it would end in its end state of the animation. And then it will be gone. So what we need to do to fix this is actually use the CSS @supports media query. If you're using plain CSS, it would look a little bit like this. You create an @supports media query, just like you would create a regular media query, where in here you write your test. So for example, animation timeline scroll. And only if that's a valid property for the browser, it will render everything that's inside here. So this way you can only render all of your animations if it supports the scroll timeline. In Tailwind, however, we need to create our supports media queries in a little bit different way. For that, we have a supports property in the config that we can use. And you can, for example, if we want to recreate the version on the left, we could say flex, and then we say display flex. That will be exactly the same as this on the left side. So this way you would do a test if the browser would support display flex. However, in our case, we want to test for the scroll-driven animations. So let's create a custom supports class name that we, for example, call scroll-driven animations. And in there, we are going to test for animation timeline scroll. So this will then give us a class name, supports : scroll-driven animations. And in Tailwind, we could then, for example, say :background red 300. So this way it would only apply the background red 300 when the scroll-driven animations are supported by the browser. But that would, in this case, make it just a little bit more ugly because we would have to add that to multiple properties. So we can also inverse the support. We can say it does not support animation timeline. And then we're also gonna rename our class to no scroll-driven animations. So now we actually test for exactly the opposite. And we can use this by going back to our app, and then we can add a class name on here, supports no scroll-driven animations, where we can say animate none. So this way, if scroll-driven animations are not supported, it will reset any animation. So if we go back to our current example, everything still works. But if we now go to Safari, we also see that the text is visible. But if you scroll, there's simply no animation because we have removed the animation from this browser, which is perfectly fine in the case that it's not supported, I think. Now there is one more thing that we need to change in our animation though, because in the animation we've added a duration, which doesn't do anything for the scroll timeline, but we also added an easing, and it's not very well visible in this example, but what you see is that it keeps on scrolling a little bit. It's adding that easing because we have added it, but it could result in quite some ugly behavior, especially because I'm using a trackpad for my Mac here, and it also already applies some easing. So then it tries to ease that easing, and that can give quite a horrible experience. So most common for these scroll-driven animations is to actually change that easing into linear and also remove the animation duration. And then we have exactly the same result, but it's fully connected to the scroll. Now to summarize what we did, let's quickly toggle word wrap. We've added this animation that just moves the element down and fades it out. We reset that animation if scroll-driven animations are not supported. And then we've created a timeline that's connected to the scroll of the full document. And we told the browser that we want only to listen to a specific range of that scroll animation. And those 4 things are the only thing we need to add to get this to work. And that is honestly so neat. There is no JavaScript libraries we need for this anymore. So the second example I also want to show you is this big quote underneath here. Because what I actually want to listen to for this element to decide how it should look and grow and scale is not the scroll position of the body, because it's quite hard to know what pixel or percentage it would be visible at. But we're actually gonna base the animation, and thus, for example, the scale of this element, on whether the element itself is visible or not, and how much of the element is visible. Because that's another thing that's absolutely possible with scroll-driven animations. So the first thing we again have to do is create a new animation specifically for this element. So let's go back to our keyframes. We're gonna add a keyframe animation, make it bigger. And as a starting point, that will simply, at 0%, have a transform of translate y of 0%. Then at 80% of that animation, I think it would look really nice if we would add a translate y of -30. Then at 90%, we're gonna animate it a bit up again. So let's make that -10%. But from that point on, we're also adding the scale in there. So let's, for example, add a scale of 1.75, which means that it already starts scaling up at the 0% mark, because we didn't define a scale here. So it will scale from 1 to 1.75 in the 90% time. And then at the last 10%, I'm gonna add another transform, and then we're gonna translate y to 0%, so it's back in its normal position, and we will also scale it up just a little bit more. And on top of that, we're also gonna add an opacity of 0.3, And I'm also gonna make it have a z-index of -1. So that way in the end state, it will lie underneath the text element. So it won't animate that z-index, but it will apply it at the end of the animation state. So that way the text of the next paragraph will be over top of it. Then we need to add that animation as well. So let's create an animation, make it bigger again. Then we're gonna change the easing that Copilot added into linear, and we're gonna remove the duration. Then we go back to our quote that we find here, and then we can add animate, make it bigger. So if we now take a look at the element, we of course see the end state because we didn't define the scroll timeline yet. But the other thing we also need to do is add our no scroll driven animation support, where we add animate none as well. And then the only thing left to do is add our animation timelines. So this again works exactly the same. We're going to use square brackets and add animation timeline. And then this time, instead of scroll, we're going to define it with a CSS variable. So let's, for example, call that --quote. And unfortunately, because we're using Tailwind, and Tailwind, at least for now, adds a var around this, which we shouldn't do in this specific case. That means we have to escape our minuses, which is a little bit ugly, but I guess we can live with it for now. So that's what we need to do. And also don't make a typo because it's animation timeline. And now we have defined it as being a custom timeline instead of the scroll. However, this variable isn't defined anywhere. So the way this works is that you add another property on the element you actually want to base this timeline on. And in our case, it's the position of this exact same element, which is totally fine. You can listen to exactly the same element and animate it at the same time. The property we need to add for that is view timeline name. So if we add square brackets and then write view timeline name, we're gonna escape it again, unfortunately, but we add the quote name on here as well. Then all of a sudden, those two are connected to each other. And you already saw that the animation changed on the left side. It's not fully working yet because it's kind of doing something. It's moving the text up and down and you see a bit of an opacity change. But that is because the way this timeline works by default is the range is the element is fully invisible at the bottom of the screen all the way until it's fully invisible at the top of the screen. So just like with the scroll timeline, we can add an animation range on here. And we can, for example, specify this with a percentage. We can say we want to listen from 0% to, for example, it being 60% of the way up. And if we would add that, you already see that the text starts to scale. And it's also moving now based on its own position, whether it's in view or not. Believe it or not, this is the only thing we have to do to make this animation work based on its own scroll position. And there you have it. By adding a few of these properties, we were able to animate this page and add so much more to a really boring static page. I am super excited about this new feature and all of these new things that are coming to CSS. And I really hope you are just as excited about them as I am. Don't forget to check the links down below as well, because in there you find the code of this example as well as a live playground to experiment with it yourself. Leave a like if you enjoyed this video, and then I will hope to see you in the next video. Thank you so much for watching.